This is not how alliances fracture. A tariff gets announced in February. Economic pressure builds through spring, trade negotiations stall into summer, and then, without warning, a 47-page legal document arrives at NATO headquarters in Brussels, containing language that has never been used between Western allies in the entire history of the Atlantic Alliance. Article 5. Collective defense. The clause designed to respond to Soviet tank divisions crossing European borders. Now invoked, according to unconfirmed reports, by Canada against the United States. Most people think NATO exists to defend against external threats. They assume the collective defense mechanism points outward toward adversaries, not inward toward members. That assumption is now being tested. What I am describing is a reported escalation in Canada-US relations that, if accurate, represents the most serious constitutional crisis in NATO's 77-year history. The details remain disputed. The implications are not. Public conversation about US-Canada tensions focused on tariffs and trade disputes, steel exports, lumber duties, energy pricing. These were framed as economic disagreements requiring negotiation and compromise. The assumption was both countries would manage disputes within existing frameworks, trade tribunals, diplomatic channels, political summits, the mechanisms designed for allied disagreement. That assumption stopped being operative, according to draft reports, when Canadian legal advisors concluded that American economic actions had crossed from trade pressure into what the document allegedly describes as economic warfare, threatening Canadian sovereignty. This is where leverage becomes existential. The 47-page filing, if it exists as reported, does not request NATO intervention in a trade dispute. It reportedly argues that systematic American economic coercion, tariffs weaponized to force political concessions, threats to critical infrastructure, and disruption of essential supply chains constitutes the kind of sustained attack on territorial integrity and political independence that Article 5 was designed to address. The legal theory is precise. Article 5 does not specify military attack. It refers to armed attack. But subsequent NATO legal interpretations have acknowledged that attack in the 21st century can take forms beyond conventional military force. Cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, sustained economic coercion designed to force political capitulation, actions that threaten a member state's ability to function as a sovereign entity. Canadian legal advisors, according to these reports, are arguing that American tariffs combined with threats to cut off energy markets, restrict access to critical supply chains, and isolate Canada economically constitute sustained coercion that meets the Article 5 threshold when viewed cumulatively rather than as individual measures. The argument is not that tariffs alone trigger Article 5. The argument is that a coordinated campaign of economic pressure designed to force Canada to accept subordinate status within North America represents an attack on Canadian sovereignty that NATO members are obligated to address. This is not how Article 5 was supposed to work. This is how it works when economic interdependence becomes weaponized and when traditional allies find themselves in structural conflict over fundamental questions of sovereignty and independence. The reported 72-hour timeline creates the pressure point. If Canada formally invokes Article 5, NATO members face a choice they were never designed to make: side with the United States, or acknowledge that Canada's sovereignty claim has merit. There is no neutral position in Article 5 proceedings. The mechanism requires collective response. Every NATO member must either validate the claim that an attack has occurred or reject it. The alliance either acts collectively or admits that collective defense does not apply when the threat comes from within. NATO has no precedent for this scenario. The alliance has never confronted a situation where a founding member accuses another founding member of actions warranting collective defense response. The constitutional framework assumes external threats, not internal conflicts. The reported European response, particularly from Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, suggests that major NATO powers are treating the Canadian position as legitimate enough to require serious consideration rather than immediate dismissal. This is where the crisis becomes structural rather than rhetorical. If European NATO members acknowledge that Canada's sovereignty concerns have merit, they validate the argument that American economic coercion can constitute an attack under Article 5. If they reject Canada's position, they establish that economic warfare between allies falls outside NATO's collective defense obligations. Either outcome restructures the alliance. Validating Canada's claim means NATO can be invoked in economic disputes between members. Rejecting it means sovereignty has limits when facing pressure from larger allies. The American response, according to early indicators, has been to frame the reported Canadian action as betrayal. The language coming from Washington describes Article 5 invocation against the United States as an attempt to manipulate alliance mechanisms for advantage in a trade dispute. This framing treats Canadian sovereignty concerns as illegitimate and Canadian legal strategy as opportunistic rather than defensive. The response suggests American officials view NATO as an instrument of American strategic interests, rather than as a collective defense mechanism that applies equally to all members. The disconnect is fundamental. Canada reportedly argues it is defending sovereignty against economic coercion. He, United States, argues Canada is weaponizing alliance mechanisms to gain leverage in ordinary trade negotiations. Both positions cannot be simultaneously valid. The reported crisis extends beyond NATO to encompass NORAD, the joint US-Canada aerospace defense system that has operated continuously since 1958. If Canada is arguing that the United States poses a threat requiring NATO intervention, the logic extends to questioning whether joint defense arrangements with the United States remain viable. NORAD integration assumes aligned interests and mutual trust. Those assumptions become incoherent if one partner is simultaneously invoking NATO collective defense against the other. The aerospace defense system either continues operating despite fundamental political rupture, or it becomes another casualty of sovereignty conflict. The precedent implications are what make this reported development historically significant, regardless of immediate outcome. If Article 5 can be invoked by one NATO member against another based on economic coercion, the alliance's operational logic transforms completely. Future trade disputes between NATO members would carry the implicit threat that economic pressure could trigger collective defense obligations. Alliance members would need to calculate whether their economic policies toward other members could be characterized as sovereignty threats. The boundary between normal diplomatic pressure and actionable attack becomes contested. China and Russia, according to strategic assessments, view any NATO internal crisis as opportunity to demonstrate Western alliance fragility. The image of Canada invoking collective defense against the United States provides exactly the narrative that rival powers use to argue that Western unity is performative rather than structural. The global market response, if this crisis escalates, would likely focus on North American energy and commodity flows. Canadian energy exports to the United States, American agricultural exports to global markets through Canadian ports, and integrated supply chains spanning the border would all become uncertain. Uncertainty in these flows translates directly into price volatility. The sophistication of the reported Canadian strategy lies in recognizing that Article 5 invocation does not require proving that an attack has occurred. It requires creating a situation where NATO members must collectively decide whether an attack has occurred. The decision process itself becomes the pressure point. If NATO members conclude that Canadian sovereignty concerns are legitimate, the United States faces collective alliance pressure to modify its economic approach to Canada. If NATO members conclude Canadian concerns are not legitimate, Canada has forced every ally to take a public position on the limits of American economic power over neighboring states. Either outcome advances Canadian objectives. Validation provides collective support for Canadian resistance to American pressure. Rejection establishes that sovereignty has limits and clarifies which allies can be relied upon in disputes with the United States. This is not about winning an Article 5 vote. This is about forcing the vote to occur and demonstrating that Canadian sovereignty claims have enough legitimacy that major NATO powers must seriously consider them rather than immediately dismiss them. The reported 72-hour timeline functions as escalation mechanism. The compressed time frame prevents extended deliberation and forces rapid position taking. NATO members must decide quickly whether Canadian sovereignty concerns warrant collective response or whether economic pressure between allies falls outside Article 5 scope. The decision will be made in national capitals rather than in Brussels. Germany must decide whether German interests lie with maintaining Atlantic unity or acknowledging that sovereignty principles apply even within alliances. France must calculate whether French strategic autonomy is better served by supporting Canadian independence or by preserving American-led alliance cohesion. The United Kingdom faces a choice about whether post-Brexit relationships depend on automatic alignment with Washington or on principle-based positions that sometimes conflict with American preferences. These are decisions that restructure alliance politics regardless of how they resolve. The fact that these questions are being asked changes what NATO means operationally. By the time this reported crisis reaches conclusion, the Canada-US relationship will have been fundamentally redefined. Either the United States will have modified its approach to demonstrate respect for Canadian sovereignty, or Canada will have established that NATO collective defense does not apply when economic pressure comes from the alliance's most powerful member. Neither outcome restores the previous relationship. Both outcomes establish new boundaries. And boundaries, once established through crisis, persist long after the immediate dispute resolves. This is not how alliances were supposed to fracture. This is how they fracture when economic interdependence creates leverage that smaller members refuse to accept, and when legal mechanisms designed for external defense get repurposed for internal sovereignty disputes. The Article 5 language was written to respond to Soviet tanks. It is reportedly being deployed to respond to American tariffs. The transformation from military defense to economic sovereignty represents a fundamental expansion of what collective defense means in practice. History will record whether NATO members validated that expansion or rejected it. But history has already recorded that the question was asked. And questions, once asked within alliance structures, cannot be unasked. The precedent is set by the reported invocation itself, regardless of outcome. Article 5 is now, according to these reports, a mechanism that can be considered for economic coercion between allies. That consideration changes everything about how alliance members approach economic relationships with each other. By the time the full details become public, the strategic landscape will have already shifted. The alliance designed to defend against external threats is confronting whether it applies to internal power dynamics. The answer will define what NATO becomes in the 21st century. This is not a trade dispute. This is a constitutional crisis. And constitutional crises, once triggered, follow their own logic regardless of whether anyone wanted them to occur.